The morning it all began was deceptively peaceful. Birds chirped lazily in the trees, the sun hung low and golden, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted across the quiet cul-de-sac. For a moment, it felt like the neighborhood was the very picture of suburban perfection. But perfection, I would soon learn, had a price. And that price came in the form of a single folded letter taped to my front door. I had lived in Cedar Grove Estates for 2 years by then. It was one of those tightly managed suburban communities where lawns were measured in inches, mailboxes had to match, and every house looked like a mirror image of the next. People smiled politely in passing but rarely stopped to chat. Everyone pretended to be friendly, but behind those manicured hedges, judgment ran deep. The HOA was the unspoken ruler of it all. A force that kept the streets looking clean, the paint colors uniform, and the spirit of individuality thoroughly suffocated. At the center of this micro-managed kingdom sat the HOA president, a woman named Margaret Hensley. She was the kind of person who turned neighborhood watch into a religion. With her clipboard, sun visor, and permanent frown, she was the self-appointed guardian of community standards. When I first moved in, I had laughed off the warnings from other neighbors. Keep your grass trimmed, don't leave your trash cans out overnight, and for heaven's sake, don't plant anything not approved by the board. It all seemed ridiculous at the time. I wasn't a rule breaker. I just wanted a quiet place to live, a home where I could unwind after work and tend to my small flower garden, a passion I'd inherited from my grandmother. But that letter on my door changed everything. It was printed on thick, official-looking paper with the HOA's seal embossed at the top. The tone was cold, formal, and unmistakably hostile. It stated that my flower garden, an arrangement of bright wildflowers and native plants, was not in compliance with HOA landscaping guidelines. It further declared that the unauthorized flora must be removed within 14 days or I would face escalating fines. I remember standing there, letter in hand, staring out at my small patch of color, a tiny oasis of reds, yellows, purples, and whites swaying in the breeze. It wasn't even large. A narrow border along the walkway framed by smooth stones. Yet to Margaret and her board of suburban enforcers, it was apparently a crime against order. I tried to reason with myself at first. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they had mistaken my flowers for weeds. Maybe all I had to do was explain. But even as I thought that, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I'd seen how the HOA handled noncompliance before. The family down the street had been fined for painting their door the wrong shade of blue. Another neighbor had to replace their mailbox because it wasn't from the approved vendor list. There were no misunderstandings in Cedar Grove, only rules and consequences for breaking them. For a few days I ignored the letter. I went about my life, tending my garden in quiet defiance. But Margaret noticed. Of course, she noticed. Her morning walks always took her past my house. She'd pause, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowing at the sight of my blooms. Sometimes she took photos. Other times she scribbled notes. It became clear that this wasn't about plants, it was about control. A week later, the second letter came. This one was harsher. It included an exact fine amount and a threat of further action if I didn't comply. It felt like harassment. My little garden, which had once been a source of peace, now filled me with anxiety. I began to feel watched, judged, cornered. Still, I refused to destroy what I'd built. My flowers were harmless, beautiful even. They attracted butterflies, bees, and the occasional hummingbird. They brought life to a neighborhood that otherwise looked like a row of sterile plastic models. Why should I bow down to someone else's idea of beauty? That defiance marked the beginning of something much larger than I ever expected. Within days, word spread. Some neighbors whispered in support, quietly, cautiously. Others avoided eye contact, fearful of being associated with me. A few even sided openly with the HOA, claiming my wild garden made the street look unkempt. The division had begun. Then came the final warning notice. It was left on my windshield this time, tucked beneath the wiper blade like a parking ticket. It gave me 72 hours to remove all unauthorized plant material or face immediate HOA intervention. It was signed, personally, by Margaret herself. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Up until then, I'd tried to play by the rules, to keep peace, to maintain the illusion of harmony. But as I stared at that smug signature, something hardened in me. I was done being polite. If Margaret thought she could bully me into submission, she was wrong. I spent that evening sitting on my porch watching the sun dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the neat, sterile lawns. Mine stood out now, colorful, vibrant, alive. The others looked dead in comparison. And that's when the idea took hold. If my flowers were such a problem, maybe I should give the HOA something real to complain about. The next morning, I drove to the nursery and filled my car with plants. Ferns, vines, palms, and flowering shrubs of every color imaginable. I didn't stop there. I ordered tropical seeds online, creeping ground covers, and ornamental grasses that could grow tall enough to form a living wall. If Margaret wanted conformity, she was about to get chaos. That weekend, I started digging. My small patch of flowers expanded into a full-blown project. I replaced patches of grass with rich, dark soil and layered it with plants that would grow fast and wild. My backyard became a jungle of green, a labyrinth of leaves and blossoms that twisted toward the sky. Every evening, after the HOA office closed, I worked. By moonlight, I planted. By sunrise, I watered. And by the end of the first week, my yard had transformed into something unrecognizable, lush, untamed, breathtakingly alive. But the real shock came when the first HOA patrol saw it. They stopped their golf cart at the curb, gawking at the explosion of color and greenery. One of them took photos. The other shook his head, already dialing Margaret's number. The war had officially begun. As I stood at the edge of my new garden, hands dirty, sweat on my brow, and satisfaction blooming in my chest, I knew there was no turning back. I had challenged the system, and the system was about to fight back. The piece of Cedar Grove Estates was about to be shattered, one petal at a time. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The Monday after my botanical rebellion, I woke to the sound of engines idling in front of my house. Through the blinds, I saw two board members, clipboard in hand, expressions tight and disapproving, standing at the curb like inspectors at a crime scene. Their golf cart bore the HOA seal, polished and self-righteous under the morning sun. Beside them stood Margaret, the president herself, her arms crossed, lips pursed, surveying my property like a general before battle. What they saw must have horrified them. My front yard was no longer a neat suburban patch of trimmed grass and ornamental shrubs. Instead, it had become a miniature ecosystem. Towering banana plants rustled in the breeze, vines crept along the fence, and bright bursts of tropical flowers painted the air with color. It was wild, alive, and utterly non-compliant with everything Cedar Grove Estate stood for. They began taking photographs from every angle, pointing out supposed violations. I watched quietly from my porch, sipping my coffee as they documented what would become the first salvo in a long and ugly fight. Later that day, the letter came. Thicker than before, filled with citations and threats. It declared that I had violated multiple sections of the HOA landscaping code, including the prohibitions against non-native species, obstructive growth, and unsightly clutter. It ordered me to remove all unapproved vegetation immediately or face daily fines and potential legal action. They called it an inspection. I called it intimidation. For a few moments, doubt crept in. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe the smart thing would be to trim it back, make some compromises, keep the peace. But as I walked through my newly created garden, brushing past leaves that shimmered with dew and hearing the gentle hum of bees, I remembered why I'd done it. This wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about principle. About standing up to control disguised as community. So I ignored the letter. The HOA responded predictably. The next week, I received notice of a formal hearing scheduled at the community center. I was to appear before the board to address ongoing noncompliance. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to make an example out of me. The day of the hearing arrived under gray skies. Inside the small, sterile meeting room, the air felt heavy with tension. Margaret sat at the center of the long table, flanked by the other board members like a tribunal. A few neighbors had shown up too, some curious, some supportive, others clearly there for the spectacle. The board presented their list of violations, page after page of rules I'd supposedly broken. They spoke of aesthetic harmony, property values, and community image. I sat quietly, letting them go on, because I could see it now. This was never about my garden. It was about power. They wanted compliance, not beauty, obedience, not individuality. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my tone calm, measured, respectful. I cited my rights as a homeowner, referenced local environmental ordinances that encouraged native and drought-resistant plants, and pointed out that my landscaping wasn't damaging or dangerous. It was just different. I could see the frustration building in Margaret's face with every word. She wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not by someone who came prepared. When the hearing ended, they didn't issue a ruling. Margaret simply said they would deliberate. But I could tell from her eyes that they had already decided. The official decision came 2 days later. The HOA ruled that my yard was in severe violation of community standards and gave me a final 10-day deadline to restore conformity. Failure to do so would result in daily fines and potential legal proceedings. It was their declaration of war. But I wasn't the same quiet homeowner they thought I was. Instead of backing down, I doubled down. I began expanding the jungle. The backyard grew thicker, greener, more intricate. I installed a small pond surrounded by rocks and lilies, added bamboo screens, and planted fruiting trees along the fence line. Every inch of my property became a defiant statement, a living, breathing protest against conformity. Neighbors started to notice. Children pointed at the butterflies that danced through the air. Some adults slowed their cars as they passed, curious or quietly impressed. A few brave ones even stopped by to compliment the transformation when they thought no one was watching. But others, those loyal to Margaret and her vision of perfection, scowled, whispered, and took photos for evidence. Then one morning, I woke to the sound of something that sent a chill through my veins: chainsaws. At first, I thought it was just a contractor working nearby. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. 2 hired workers standing at the edge of my property line, orange vests gleaming, ready to start cutting. Margaret stood nearby, supervising, a self-satisfied smirk on her face. They were here to remove the obstructions, she said. The HOA had authorized corrective landscaping. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply called the police. The officers arrived quickly, and after a tense exchange, the workers were forced to leave. Margaret fumed, waving papers and citing bylaws, but the officers told her she had no authority to enter private property without a court order. When she finally stormed off, I stood in the middle of my garden, shaken but victorious. They had tried to break me through intimidation, fines, and fear, and now trespassing. But they'd overplayed their hand. That chainsaw stunt would prove to be a turning point, one that would expose just how far the HOA was willing to go to enforce its control. I began documenting everything: letters, fines, photos, videos, every interaction, every threat. I started building my case, because I knew it was only a matter of time before this battle moved beyond the neighborhood. And it did. Within a week, the HOA filed a formal complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office. They wanted me fined at the municipal level. But that decision would backfire spectacularly, because once the county got involved, everything the HOA had done would come under scrutiny. I didn't know it then, but Margaret's obsession had set in motion the very thing that would bring her downfall. As I stood at the edge of my overgrown paradise that evening, the sun glowing through the thick canopy of leaves, I realized something important. I hadn't just built a garden. I'd built a symbol. And the fight for it was only beginning. The complaint from the HOA arrived at the county offices with a stack of attached photos and citations, each one carefully printed, labeled, and highlighted. Margaret had made sure her case looked airtight. She accused me of creating a nuisance, harboring invasive vegetation, and violating community and environmental codes. What she hadn't counted on, however, was the difference between HOA rules and actual law. A week after the complaint was filed, a county code enforcement officer visited my property for an inspection. Unlike Margaret's inspectors, this man was calm, professional, and clearly uninterested in neighborhood gossip. He walked through the garden with a small notepad, pausing to examine a few plants, snapping photos, and jotting down observations. He asked a few factual questions about drainage, property lines, and maintenance. As he looked around, I could see the faintest hint of a smile forming. The garden wasn't the wild chaos Margaret had described. It was structured, layered, and thriving. There were designated walking paths, a pond with filtration, and well-maintained irrigation. Everything was intentional. He thanked me for my time and left without issuing any citations. 3 days later, I received the report: no violations found. That single line shattered the HOA's illusion of authority. The county had effectively ruled that my property was compliant with local law. The so-called violations existed only in the OA's handbook, rules written to preserve the neighborhood's cookie-cutter aesthetic, not to uphold any legitimate standard. When the board received the same report, it sent Margaret into a fury. Her next email to the community was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive indignation. accusing certain residents of disrespecting the collective vision and hiding behind technicalities. But the tide had started to turn. Neighbors who once stayed quiet began murmuring support. Some who'd been fined for minor issues, a misplaced trash bin, a flower pot on the porch, a slightly faded mailbox, started realizing how arbitrary the OA's power really was. Margaret had ruled through fear and fines for years, but now her authority looked vulnerable. I, however, wasn't done. With the county's report in hand, I began pushing back harder. I submitted a formal appeal to rescind my fines, attaching the inspection report as evidence. The board delayed, avoided, and lost paperwork, but I persisted. When they finally denied the appeal anyway, I escalated it to small claims court. That decision marked the true beginning of the end. The HOA suddenly found itself facing scrutiny it wasn't prepared for. The court required them to provide documentation of their authority to fine and enter properties. They were forced to reveal their budget, their enforcement policies, and their meeting records. What those records showed wasn't pretty. Buried in the details were inconsistencies, improper notices, missing votes, and questionable uses of funds. It turned out Margaret had been approving certain landscaping contracts herself, using HOA money without full board consent. A few board members quietly resigned when this surfaced. Others distanced themselves from her entirely. Meanwhile, my garden flourished. Butterflies swarmed the blooms. Hummingbirds hovered over the pond. The once quiet corner of the neighborhood had become something of a local curiosity. Parents brought their children to walk by and look at the flowers. Elderly neighbors stopped to rest on the small stone bench I'd built under a tree. The air smelled of jasmine and wet soil, a soft reminder that peace could exist even amidst conflict. But peace wasn't what Margaret wanted. At the next board meeting, she attempted to pass an emergency amendment banning any plant exceeding 4 feet in height within the front yard of any residence. It was a desperate move to retroactively criminalize my garden. This time, though, the community pushed back. Dozens of residents showed up to the meeting, more than ever before. Many had their own grievances, unjust fines, ignored maintenance requests, or arbitrary rule changes. For the first time in years, people were standing up to the HOA, not cowering before it. Margaret's tone turned defensive. She tried to paint me as a troublemaker, a disruptive influence. But the more she spoke, the more transparent her bitterness became. When she finally called for a vote, the amendment failed spectacularly. Even 2 of her loyalists abstained. After that meeting, her control began to crumble. The board called for a special audit of finances, one that would later expose the depth of her mismanagement. Contractors she'd hired turned out to be personal acquaintances, and the HOA's reserve fund had mysteriously shrunk under her watch. While that investigation quietly unfolded, I kept my focus steady. I maintained the garden meticulously, ensuring that not a single leaf or branch could be cited against me. Every corner was tidy, every plant trimmed, every water feature properly filtered. The more perfect it became, the more powerless they looked. Then, one late afternoon, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. It was written hastily, on OA letterhead but without signatures. It demanded immediate compliance and threatened further consequences. It was clear that Margaret was acting alone now, desperate, reckless, grasping for the last shred of authority she still believed she had. I took the notice, photographed it, and added it to my growing file. The next week, I received a letter from the OA's attorney, a formal cease and desist notice regarding defamation and harassment. It accused me of tarnishing the reputation of the HOA board. It was baseless, of course, but it revealed something deeper. They were afraid. Margaret was losing her grip. And when fear drives people like her, they make mistakes, big ones. The moment that would finally expose her came sooner than I expected. One night, a neighbor texted me a photo. It showed Margaret, flashlight in hand, sneaking onto my property, snapping pictures in the dark. That was all I needed. I filed a report with the local police, attaching the photo, timestamps, and the prior history of threats and trespass attempts. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting boundaries. By the time the police contacted her, the news had already spread. The story of the HOA president sneaking around at night, spying on a homeowner, was too juicy for the neighborhood gossip mill to ignore. Margaret's credibility disintegrated almost overnight. The investigation into her finances was still ongoing, and now she faced accusations of harassment and misuse of power. The once untouchable HOA president had become a liability to her own board. And through it all, the garden continued to grow, lush, vibrant, untamed. What had started as a small act of defiance had evolved into something much larger. It wasn't just about flowers or fines anymore. It was about freedom, resilience, and the quiet strength of standing your ground against control. By the time spring arrived, the board announced a special election to restructure leadership. Margaret's resignation letter followed days later. But the story didn't end there. Because, as the board changed hands, I found myself standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice between stepping back into peace or stepping forward into something new. And what came next would surprise even me. When the notice for a special election appeared on the HOA bulletin board and in everyone's mailboxes, it felt like the air in Cedar Grove Estate shifted. For years, the board had been a closed circle, the same names recycling through the same positions, protected by Margaret's grip on power. But now, for the first time, there was an opening, an opportunity for change. The residents were restless. The whispers that once filled cul-de-sacs and backyard fences had grown into open conversations. People who had once stayed quiet about unfair fines or unreasonable rules were now emboldened. Margaret's downfall had shown them that the HOA wasn't untouchable. It could be challenged. It could be changed. And that's when the idea began to take root. At first, I resisted it. I told myself I just wanted peace. To enjoy my home, my garden, my quiet mornings without the sound of engines idling outside or letters stuffed into my mailbox. But as neighbors began coming to me, asking for advice, thanking me for standing up, suggesting I throw my name in, I realized that peace wouldn't last unless someone rebuilt the system that had allowed all this to happen. So, I ran for HOA President. It felt surreal at first. The same institution that had tried to find me into submission was now one I sought to lead. But this time, it wasn't about control. It was about accountability, transparency, and fairness, values that had long vanished under Margaret's rule. The weeks leading up to the election were tense. Flyers appeared on doors and in mailboxes, some in support of me, others warning that I was a troublemaker who would destroy community standards. It was clear Margaret still had allies, people who clung to the idea of uniform lawns and identical flower beds, terrified of change. But the majority of residents had grown tired of fear. They wanted balance. They wanted reason. They wanted to live without constant surveillance. On the night of the election, the community center was packed. The atmosphere was electric. Part town hall, part reckoning. People filled every chair, others standing along the walls. The board members, those who hadn't resigned, sat stiffly at the front, faces pale under the fluorescent lights. When the votes were tallied, it wasn't even close. I was elected president by a landslide. The applause that erupted wasn't loud or raucous. It was steady, heartfelt, like the collective sigh of a neighborhood finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. Margaret wasn't present that night. Her resignation had been submitted quietly, her name removed from the roster. But her shadow lingered in the room like the echo of old control. My first act as president was simple transparency. Within a week, I opened the HOA's financial records to the community. I published budgets, meeting minutes, and spending reports online for every homeowner to see. The hidden fees, the vague maintenance costs, the discretionary spending, all of it came into the light. The numbers told a story of mismanagement and neglect. Thousands of dollars had been wasted on unnecessary contracts, cosmetic improvements that benefited only a few, and fines that were never properly documented. People were outraged, but also relieved. At last, the truth was visible. Next came reform. We rewrote sections of the bylaws, removing vague language that gave the board unchecked power. We established a fair appeals process for fines and required community approval for any major amendments. We even introduced a resident beautification clause, encouraging homeowners to personalize their properties with gardens, decor, or creative landscaping, so long as it was safe and well kept. It was poetic justice. The same rules once used to punish me were now rewritten to protect others from the same treatment. For the first time, Cedar Grove estates began to look alive. Yards bloomed with color. Porch swings appeared where before there had been only uniform benches. One neighbor painted her front door bright red, a bold statement in a place where beige had once been mandatory. The sterile sameness that Margaret had enforced for years began to fade, replaced by individuality and warmth. But reform didn't come without resistance. A small faction of traditionalists, led by one of Margaret's old allies, began circulating petitions to restore order. They complained that the neighborhood was losing its character, and that my leadership was encouraging disorder. Their rhetoric was desperate, nostalgic for a control they no longer had. They tried to rally support, but it fizzled. Most residents remembered the years of intimidation, the fines, the notices, the way Margaret had spied on her neighbors. They weren't going back. Meanwhile, my garden, the one that had started it all, became something of a community landmark. Families took weekend walks to see it. Kids loved to count the butterflies, and local garden clubs asked if they could feature it in their newsletters. What had once been labeled unsightly was now a symbol of renewal. But amidst all the positive change, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while sorting through HOA correspondence, I came across a letter addressed to the president of Cedar Grove Estates. It was from Margaret. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even defiant. It was reflective, an apology in her own way. She wrote about the pressures of maintaining the neighborhood's image, the fear of losing control, the way the power had consumed her. She said she'd watched the changes from a distance and admitted, begrudgingly, that the community seemed happier now. For a moment, I just sat there, holding that letter. It would have been easy to gloat, to dismiss it as too little too late. But instead, I felt a strange sense of closure. Margaret wasn't just the villain of this story. She was a product of the very system that rewarded control and punished individuality. She had simply played her part until it destroyed her. That night, as I walked through the garden, the soft hum of crickets rising around me, I realized how far things had come. From a single flower that sparked outrage to a neighborhood transformed, it all felt surreal. The vines that once clung tightly to my fence now climbed higher, reaching toward the sky. The pond reflected the moonlight in ripples, and for the first time in years, the street felt quiet, not with tension, but with peace. Cedar Grove Estates had finally found balance. But just as things began to settle, a new letter arrived. This time from the county again. It wasn't about my garden. It was about zoning. Apparently, someone had reported that my backyard pond might be noncompliant with water feature regulations. The timing was suspicious, the complaint anonymous. It seemed that not everyone had learned their lesson after all. And as I looked out across my lush, thriving sanctuary, I realized something: peace in a place like this was never permanent. The HOA might have changed, but the spirit of control still lurked, waiting for another opening. I smiled because this time I was ready. The letter arrived on a windy Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. It carried the county's seal stamped in blue ink, the kind of official mark that made anyone's heart skip for a moment. For a brief second, I thought it might be a mistake, some clerical oversight, a random inspection notice. But as I unfolded the paper and read the first few lines, I knew it was anything but random. Someone had reported me again. According to the county zoning department, my backyard pond might be in violation of local water feature regulations, pending review. The phrasing was vague but deliberate, enough to trigger a formal inspection. It wasn't the HOA this time, it was the county itself. That meant whoever filed the complaint knew exactly what they were doing. It was subtle revenge. A new attack masked as civic concern. For days, the thought consumed me. I'd already endured years of HOA harassment, endured Margaret's tyranny, fought to make change, and rebuilt trust within the neighborhood. I had finally found peace. And now, it seemed, someone wanted to disrupt that peace by dragging me into yet another bureaucratic nightmare. I didn't have to look far for suspects. The small group of traditionalists who had once backed Margaret had grown quieter after the last election. But they hadn't disappeared. I'd seen them whispering at the mailbox cluster, exchanging quick glances when I walked by. One of them, Mr. Haynes, a retired accountant with a perfectly trimmed hedge and an obsessive dislike for non-standard landscaping, had always been vocal about his distaste for my garden. He saw the HOA reforms as the beginning of chaos, the end of order. It didn't take much imagination to picture him filing an anonymous zoning complaint. Still, speculation wouldn't help. The county inspector's visit was already scheduled for the following week. I had to prepare. For the next several days, I combed through every county ordinance related to residential landscaping and water features. The rules were dense, full of technical jargon and contradictory clauses. But one thing became clear: as long as the pond didn't alter drainage patterns or exceed certain dimensions, it was compliant. Mine met every requirement. It was built responsibly, properly lined, and maintained. But rules didn't always matter when someone wanted to make trouble. When the inspector arrived, he was polite but distant. A man used to confrontation, clipboard in hand, the county logo embroidered on his jacket. He walked the perimeter of my yard, took photos, measured the pond, checked the filter system, and scribbled notes. I followed quietly, watching his expression shift subtly between curiosity and confusion. At one point, he paused beside the pond, where koi fish darted just below the surface, sunlight glinting off their scales. He seemed almost reluctant to label something so peaceful as noncompliant. After 30 minutes, he closed his clipboard and gave a curt nod. He told me he'd file his report within a few days. The decision, he said, would come by mail. Those next few days dragged endlessly. Every sound outside, every car door, every mailbox lid closing, sent a spark of anxiety through me. It wasn't just about the pond anymore, it was about the principle. Someone was trying to bring back the fear that had once ruled this place. Someone wanted to remind me that control, in neighborhoods like this, never truly disappeared. It only shifted hands. When the envelope finally arrived, I didn't open it right away. I stood by the window, holding it, the sunlight filtering through the blinds in narrow lines. Then, slowly, I tore it open. The pond was compliant. No violations, no fines, no further action required. The sense of relief that washed over me was indescribable. But beneath it was something deeper, a steady, simmering determination. Whoever had done this hadn't expected me to fight back with facts, documents, and resilience. They'd expected me to panic, to fold, to remove the pond and retreat into submission. Instead, I had turned their weapon into my proof of legitimacy. That evening, I attended the HOA's monthly meeting. Attendance had been growing since the reforms. Neighbors who once avoided the gatherings now came with ideas, not complaints. When I mentioned the zoning inspection and its outcome, the room buzzed with sympathy and support. People were tired of the old games. They wanted the community to move forward. But there was another reason I brought it up. I wanted to set a precedent, so I introduced a new proposal, the homeowner protection policy. It required any HOA member who reported a violation to the county or local authorities to disclose their identity to the board. Anonymous complaints, I explained, were often weaponized, used to harass rather than help. The rule wouldn't stop legitimate reports, but it would discourage petty vendettas. The motion passed unanimously. That small victory marked another turning point. For years, fear had silenced homeowners, making them easy targets for manipulation. Now, they were reclaiming control, not through rebellion, but through reason and structure. Still, I knew better than to let my guard down. Over the following weeks, subtle tensions began to surface again. One morning, a few of my garden lights were found smashed. Another time, someone left a fake warning notice on my front door, printed on plain paper, unsigned. It was childish, but it showed that the resentment still lingered beneath the surface. Instead of retaliating, I installed a motion-activated camera near my fence. It wasn't paranoia, it was precaution. And when the footage revealed a familiar figure sneaking into my yard late at night with a flashlight, it confirmed what I already suspected Mr. Haynes. I didn't call the police. I didn't even confront him. Instead, I brought the footage to the next HOA meeting. When I played the clip, the room fell silent. There was no need for words. Haynes's face turned pale, and his attempt to defend himself fell apart under the collective weight of disapproval. By the end of the meeting, he resigned from the board, muttering something about losing faith in the community. It was over, or so it seemed. But as the weeks passed and the garden continued to flourish, I realized something fundamental had changed. The HOA no longer existed as an authority over the residents. It had become something more, an extension of them. The same energy once spent enforcing rules was now directed toward improvement, creativity, and genuine pride in the neighborhood. The lawns still looked tidy, but not identical. The flowers varied, the mailboxes had flair, and laughter filled the cold, deep sacks where silence once reigned. Yet, in the quiet moments when I stood by the pond at dusk, I couldn't help but feel a faint unease. Not fear, just awareness. Control had been broken, but the human desire to dominate, to impose order, never truly vanished. Margaret had once embodied that desire. Haynes had tried to revive it, and one day, perhaps someone else would too. For now, though, Cedar Grove was free. The pond glimmered in the fading light, the air rich with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. The community had grown stronger through its struggle. But as the wind rustled through the trees and ripples spread across the pond's surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that one more storm might still be coming, a final test, one that would determine if Cedar Grove's peace was built to last, or if it was only temporary. Months passed quietly after the incident with Haynes. The air in Cedar Grove had shifted, lighter, freer but fragile, like the stillness after a long storm. The HOA had transformed from a rigid enforcer into a genuine community council. Meetings were collaborative, decisions were transparent, and the neighborhood, for the first time in years, began to feel alive. The gardens that once conformed to dull uniformity now shimmered with individuality. There were tulips beside cacti, sunflowers brushing against hydrangeas, and entire patches of native wildflowers swaying where sterile sod had once dominated. My own jungle, once seen as rebellion, had become an emblem of renewal, a living testament to what could flourish when control gave way to creativity. The pond, meanwhile, had become the heart of it all. Children tossed breadcrumbs to the koi in the mornings, and neighbors often stopped to chat near its edge in the evenings. It was no longer my pond, it was our sanctuary. But peace in Cedar Grove, as I'd come to learn, always drew out the shadows of those who couldn't stand to see it last. It began one morning when a thick, official-looking envelope appeared on my porch. No stamp, no postmark, just my name written neatly on the front. Inside was a document titled, Community Development Petition. It was a proposal for a new beautification program drafted by none other than Margaret Wells, the former HOA president who had resigned in disgrace. Somehow she was back. The proposal outlined plans to restore aesthetic harmony to the neighborhood, reintroducing stricter landscaping guidelines, HOA inspections, and uniform color schemes. It claimed to have the support of concerned residents. The final page was a list of signatures. Only 5, but enough to trigger a formal review. I felt that old flicker of disbelief, then anger. After everything the neighborhood had endured, after all the progress we'd made, Margaret was trying to claw her way back into power. Within days, flyers began appearing on mailboxes printed in bold letters, SV Cedar Grov, Burian Mechik Estiadards. Her message was clear: she wanted to convince the fearful, the nostalgic, and the easily influenced that freedom had gone too far. The timing couldn't have been worse. Autumn was approaching, and many of the lush summer gardens were starting to fade. The once vibrant lawns now looked uneven, patchy, evidence Margaret could use to argue that disorder had returned. She attended the next OA meeting as a guest, dressed impeccably as ever, smiling that cold, calculated smile. Her presence stirred tension like dust in sunlight. Some neighbors greeted her cautiously, unsure whether to welcome or avoid her. But I didn't back down. As acting OA chair, I opened the floor to discussion. Margaret presented her case, painting a picture of decline, weeds, noise, and Yazoras spreading through Cedar Grove. Her words were polished, persuasive, and laced with nostalgia for the old order. Yet, as she spoke, I saw the unease ripple across the room. People remembered the fear, the petty fines, the whispered threats. They hadn't forgotten what standards had really meant under her rule. When it was my turn, I didn't speak with fire or anger. I simply reminded everyone of how far they'd come, how the neighborhood had rebuilt itself, how laughter had replaced tension, how gardens had turned from uniform patches of grass into reflections of their owners' personalities. Then I made an announcement: the community would host an open garden day. Every resident would be invited to showcase their yard, big or small, neat or wild, and the neighborhood would vote for the most inspiring garden. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a demonstration. The following week, the event took shape. Families set up tables, baked goods, and lemonade stands. Kids drew chalk art along the sidewalks. Music floated through the air, and the entire neighborhood came alive with color and scent. Even those skeptical of the reforms couldn't deny the atmosphere. It felt like a festival of individuality. When the time came to judge, the results were unanimous. The gardens weren't perfect, but they were beautiful in their imperfection. They told stories of resilience, of creativity, of ownership. And to my quiet surprise, the winning garden wasn't mine. It belonged to Mrs. Patel, an elderly widow who had once feared HOA fines for her rose bushes. Her front yard now bloomed in cascading shades of pink and gold, a riot of petals surrounding a small wooden sign that read simply, "Freedom grows here." The crowd applauded, and even Margaret, standing in the back, couldn't disguise the flicker of defeat that crossed her face. She left before the event ended. No one stopped her this time. By evening, As the last tables were folded and the lanterns dimmed, I stood beside the pond once more. The reflections of the trees shimmered across the water, broken by the gentle ripples of koi gliding beneath the surface. It struck me then, this entire journey, from the first complaint about my flowers to this moment of peace, had never really been about plants or rules. It had been about control, who had it and who deserved it, and at last, Cedar Grove had chosen freedom. Weeks later, word spread that Margaret had moved away. Her house went up for sale, her pristine yard suddenly looking strangely lifeless among the flourishing chaos surrounding it. A young family bought it soon after, and within days, they'd planted a small vegetable patch by the porch. It felt symbolic, the final root of her control being replaced with something living, growing real. Winter arrived quietly. The gardens went dormant, the leaves turned brittle, and the pond froze over. But even in the stillness, there was warmth, not from the flowers or sunlight, but from the community that had learned to thrive without fear. When spring returned, Cedar Grove bloomed brighter than ever. One morning, I stood outside with a mug of coffee, watching the sunrise spill gold across the neighborhood. The scent of damp soil and early blossoms filled the air. The jungle I'd planted years ago had matured into a lush, harmonious ecosystem, a living monument to everything we'd fought for. As the light danced across the water and the sound of laughter drifted from the next yard, I finally felt the quiet satisfaction of closure. Not victory, just peace. The HOA was no longer a battlefield. It was what it was always meant to be, a community. And as I looked out over the blooming chaos of Cedar Grove, wild, free, imperfectly beautiful, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's creation.